So I'm Romie Williams. I'm a senior at the Galveston School of Individualized Study, the concentration in social justice, education, and policy. So I racially identify as Black. I guess ethnically identify as African American. Mm-hmm. Yes, I do consider myself a person of color. I would believe that my experience at NYU has been different than white peers or white classmates because, I don't know, difference in skin color really, unfortunately, is a very salient aspect of kind of the way that we as people navigate in this country, and which I don't think most people like, which is, not fair, and we can go on for hours about why it exists the way it does, but to answer that question, it's very different. It's very different in the way that classmates and professors and other faculty and staff can kind of consider my aptitude as a student, or just kind of how they perceive me as a person and what their perception of me may look like compared to my own perception of me. It appears in the way that I think of myself in these spaces, as well as the way I carry myself in these spaces, which a lot of times can be really taxing and laborious, and also in a way I think, remain authentically me, which again can be contended, like what does it mean to be authentically you? Can we not be different in different spaces? Which are very valid questions. But it's definitely a kind of an unease that has kind of lingered in my experience at NYU the past 4 years. So in my experience at NYU, what I've been aware of is how often I code switch. And that's not something that I really kind of reflected on until this year. And I realized I've become like kind of the queen of code switching. And that's because it's, a type of language that's valued in these academic spaces. And with that value is also associated aptitude and intellect. And I find myself as a bright person. I like to learn. I think there's something that I could offer, right? But if I'm sitting in a conference room with a professor and like 12 other students, and I share an idea or I ask a question in the way that I would kind of articulate it in other spaces, I think the first initial kind of implicit bias that lies there is like, why is she talking like that? Or like, why is she here? Like, people who talk like, speak proper English, or like, why are you at NYU? You're supposed to be smart if you're at NYU, and smart people don't talk like that. Which is not to say that people at NYU are not aware of these things, and that people at NYU don't already understand that there are multiple ways of language and speaking literacy, and that all of them are valid. However, I do think implicit bias exists. Outside of NYU, I was always a part of the racial majority. In NYU, I've had there are 2 courses I've had where you're talking about numbers, and also assumptions, because also me assuming kind of the identities of the people in the room. But in 2 courses that I had, both of which took place in fall 2016. They were both at NYU London, taught by NYU London faculty. And one course was called Black Urban Studies. It consisted of a self-identified white woman who was the professor, and about 12 Black women as students. And then there was a course called Britain and Slavery, who was taught by, again, a self-identified white man. And it was 5 Black women and 1 white woman as students. And in both those courses, it was like, kind of the only time where everyone in the room, with the exception of 1 or 2 people, were Black and looked like me and had the same experiences, not same, but a lot of similar overlapping experiences. And yeah, so it happens. It happened in a different continent, but it happens. They committed to trying to understand as much as possible, of a cultural tradition very different than their own. And to me, I appreciated that. I respected that. I respected the commitment. From what I remember, none of them said anything that I found to be very offensive or oppressive or problematic. So I think for people like them, it definitely is a commitment to always kind of unlearn what they might have learned, and always to be aware of their biases, and always just they're always working. It's like a constant state of work to teach a class full of Black women or women of color or people of color as a white person or as someone who looks totally different. And that can be applied to our public schools, our private schools, our K-12 schools, anywhere. So it helps because the presence brings a type of, I think, comfort and almost protection, which I'm also kind of hesitant to use that word protection, because we shouldn't because even if there's other people who like us in the room, there can still be a very oppressive nature. So I don't want to say that, and that's why I said only slightly better, because you can throw in people who look like you in a room, and that doesn't change the structure of the room, doesn't change how the room is built, doesn't change how the room can be operated. So that's pretty much my short answer. It feels good, and you feel less alienated, but it's not going to entirely change your experience at a school, no. I have taken courses at Gallatin where every professor is calling out the white supremacist patriarchy. All of them, the white heterosexual men included, are calling out the white heteronormative, capitalist patriarchy, whatever. And that, I think, brings a level of awareness and safety in the classroom. Which is not to say that these professors are just totally rid of all these oppressive ways of thinking or doing, because they might still, right? But the awareness, right? And then the kind of declaration of this is my politics, and this is the way I think of this country and the world, definitely has made me like Gallatin. Enough. And in the conclusion, I write about how, Black women need to be celebrated and valued, and how we can make it a point to learn from Black women. Because when we think of knowledge or brilliance, the first person that comes to our head may not be a Black girl, right? But again, shifting of what we consider valuable, and realizing that there's value in almost everything and anything, and that we can learn from anyone, no matter what their age or their background. So I think if people knew that and reminded themselves of that, they would see more of the beauty in life, and they would see more of the power and kind of the miracles in life, because they see value in everything. So if we apply that type of paradigm to academia, then we're not going to think of these students of color, or the ones on scholarship, or the one coming from these economically disadvantaged homes or communities as deficit or lacking something. We're going to consider these students as a point of knowledge and a point of brilliance and a point of magic, So that's what I would tell women. That's what I would tell, the future generations. That's what I would tell everybody, but especially women of color, right? Especially Black women, that the entire world has told you that you're just not worthy, that you're not valuable, that you don't bring anything, that you're not good enough. But, little do they know that your existence is in itself a miracle, right? And everything you do, any type of great thing you do is a miracle, and it's something that should be lauded, and something that should be celebrated. So since alcohol EDU is mandatory, I think that other programs and training should be mandatory, because you're already making us learn about alcohol poisoning, which I thought is a little more obvious than learning about these kind of insidious oppressions, right? Maybe it's just me. I don't know. I knew better than to keep drinking until I black out, but maybe other people don't. You can't assume. So, yeah, that was a lot of sarcasm there. So I think NYU Safe Zones do a good job of laying foundations for things. which doesn't mean they're perfect, and they're constantly being updated. But I worked with the LGBTQ Center here a few years ago, and I was a outspoken peer educator, and I did like a week-long training with them before the school year started, and I facilitated a lot of safe zones. And I mean, it really is like some good material in there. And I remember one time I facilitated a safe zone to, I think, a staff of people working in like some department in the library. And these were, I would say, middle-aged and older white people. And they had so many questions. And the safe zone was about, LGBTQ individuals. And they had so many questions out of just curiosity or comprehension questions, like they wanted to understand, and they were so engaged, and I thought that was awesome. So if an older generation can be so engaged in this type of training about learning about these communities, then I think incoming students who already will have the excitement about transitioning into NYU would be excited about learning about other people and experiences, and learning about systems that exist, even though they're invisible, but that show up in so many different ways. I think setting up a schedule where during orientation week they're required to do in-person workshops, I think is more effective, because when I call EDU, I click buttons. Other students might just click buttons and not read or learn. But in an in-person workshop, you're required to be there, so